Hey, folks. So, in the previous episode, we left off discussing how Creole identity in New Orleans became associated with mixed raceness. And we discussed why that happened. It was basically because the white Creoles abandoned Creole identity in exchange for American identity and French identity to distance themselves from their brethren of color, leaving the only people self-identifying publicly as Louisiana Creole in New Orleans as people of African descent to some degree, whether mixed or not. But there's another bifurcation, division that happens after white Creoles abandon Creole identity. And this is where dark complected Creoles who quote unquote look black get shoved out of Creole identity in New Orleans. I need to stress in New Orleans because this process is completely different outside of New Orleans. New Orleans is a different ballgame altogether. And so basically what happens is when white Creoles abandon Creole identity, leaving the identity, public identity with people of color, the people of color who latched on to Creole identity the most publicly in New Orleans during Reconstruction and early Jim Crow were Louisiana Creoles who were formerly free people of color before the Civil War. So that means that they were not slaves. A lot of them had been born free. Some of them had been emancipated before the Civil War. Most of them were of mixed African and European origins. To a smaller extent, you had some who had Native American origins. And so this idea that Creole means mixed race comes into being in New Orleans at this point. And because these particular Creoles latched onto Creole identity the most during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, it caused another division, bifurcation in Creolite in New Orleans by shoving out all the Louisiana Creoles who phenotypically look black. So that means dark brown complected, coarse hair, Louisiana Creoles who also did not have French surnames, and Louisiana Creoles who, importantly, didn't live downtown or who didn't live in the 7th Ward. This is really important in understanding the stickiness of Creole identity in New Orleans today, because when most people think of Creole identity in New Orleans, you think of the Charbonnets, you think of the Morials, you think of, light complexioned people with ambiguous features, certain surnames who come out of the 7th Ward or something like that. When in fact, you still had these muted Creoles, as I came to refer to them, who still continue to practice Creole culture, who still continue to identify as Louisiana Creoles, but who get shoved uptown, which is like the Anglophone, the American quarters of New Orleans. Downtown is the French, the Latin side, the Creole side. And so the muted Creoles get shoved out of the Creole nucleus in New Orleans and live among Americans. They apostatize, they become Protestants, Methodists, Baptists, Episcopalians, some of them, and on and on and on. But these muted Creoles still continue to identify as Louisiana Creole, but not publicly, because the public face had to be black or African American because of where they were living in New Orleans and because of the politics of identity, and especially in the context of Jim Crow in New Orleans. In my opinion, muted Creoles, or first of all, they're not discussed in academia at all. They are not discussed publicly at all either. New Orleans is also a very sticky place in terms of identity because, as it pertains to Creole, because in New Orleans, because of Jim Crow, you find that people still today, they will refer to Creole food, etouffee, gumbo, and on and on and on. They will refer to Creole culture, music, for example, but Creole identity is not a public identity in New Orleans. Totally different from outside of New Orleans. And so, in my opinion, one of the areas of a study that a lot of people, both academics and non-academics, journalists included, or ignoring, are the muted Creoles. What was the process of becoming muted, a muted Creole in New Orleans? And despite being muted as Creoles, what types of Creole isms did these muted Creoles retain? Today, we're finding that more muted Creoles from New Orleans are coming to the forefront that are talking about their Creolite. A lot of this is happening because of language resuscitation, in particular with Kourivini. Not so much with French, but with Kourivini especially. We're finding that a lot of people who are muted Creoles in New Orleans are becoming comfortable with their Creole-ness through the language, and are talking about their experiences, being shoved aside. They didn't look a certain way. They didn't have the right surnames. They didn't come out of the 7th Ward, downtown, or whatever the case may be. And so those are the muted Creoles. We also have another division that's happening at the exact same time, among Creoles as well. So during Jim Crow, which is that, so I mentioned in the last episode that many white Creoles abandoned Creole identity publicly because it had to do with being touched by the tar brush, as the movie goes. In other words, being associated with people of African descent. Jim Crow was really, and this began a little bit earlier as well, but Jim Crow was really, 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 really important in terms of dividing communities, dividing Louisiana Creoles. And so any association, relationship with people of African descent could land you, beaten in the streets, ostracized by white society, and on and on and on. So what happens is, among white Creoles, you have some that began to distance themselves altogether with Creolite in exchange for American, speaking English, anglicizing their names, marrying Anglophones, Americans. So in all of these episodes, when I mention American or African American, I'm talking about people who are of Anglophone descent and Protestant. This is how Louisiana Creoles in our own languages refer to Americans, Américain. That is different from American in the nationality sense, because of course all Louisiana Creoles are nationally American, right? Have American passports and things like that. But it's an ethnic distinction that's made here in the episodes. And so the other white Creoles, they start to switch Creole with French, because of course French, when you talk about French, you think about Europe. And so Europeans are white. And so if you exchange your Creole identity for French, then it means that you're implying or even explicitly stating that you are white or of European descent. And so this is what happens with some Louisiana Creoles in New Orleans. They established these organizations like Latini Louisianais that was promoting continued Creole identity among white Creoles, not among Creoles of color, among white Creoles, and also continued speaking of French. And these became markers for whiteness, but a different type of whiteness, not Anglo whiteness, but Latin whiteness, French. And so these organizations like Latini Louisianais sent out, members throughout South Louisiana during the 19-teens, 1920s, who were in places like Abbeville, New Iberia, St. Martinville, Opelousas, and so on and so forth, who were trying to encourage other white Creoles, right, to continue speaking French and also to embrace this French public identity as opposed to Creole. Didn't work too well. It didn't work too well outside of New Orleans because a lot of people still spoke these languages. So they were preaching to the choir, right? Most people, in fact, who were Creoles outside of New Orleans still spoke Louisiana French or French in some form, Courivini, or Spanish. And so fell on deaf ears. They go back to New Orleans and they still, fight the fight for a few more decades in the 20th century. But ultimately, these people come to abandon Creole identity as well.